Irma Grese.
22 years old, with the face of an angel. So why was the entire continent of Europe terrified of her? And why, when staring death in the face, were her eyes bone dry, without a single flicker of fear? You'd expect that when the hangman's noose is draped around a neck, there would be tear, begging, and pleading. Not here. Irma Grese, the infamous hyena of Auschwitz, actually gave an order. Schnell! Make it quick. She was so incredibly arrogant that she thought she could command the Grim Reaper himself to serve her on her timeline. Just looking at that attitude is enough to make anyone's blood boil. But no matter how defiant she was, I still believe in karma. You reap what you sow, and nobody escapes the long arm of justice forever. Today, let's dig into the final moments of this monster. When justice finally came calling, was this demon truly as at peace as she pretended to be? Heavy, expensive perfume mingled with the metallic stench of fresh blood, that is the haunting scent that defined Irma Grese. From an utterly ordinary country girl, she transformed into the hyena of Auschwitz while barely in her early 20s. She wore the face of an angel to mask the heart of a true demon. She personally tortured prisoners with ruthless efficiency. Her pistol, a steel-braided riding crop, and polished leather boots were her tools of choice to beat and kick victims to death in agonizing pain. Sending victims to the gas chambers wasn't just a duty. For Irma Grese, it was a sick, twisted game to satisfy her deviant urges. The most terrifying part? She derived sheer pleasure from watching human suffering, getting a literal rush from seeing the gaping, agonizing wounds of the prisoners. She had a particular fondness for watching surgeries performed without anesthesia, or starving her dogs just to watch them savage the inmates. Her violence was often impulsive and irrational, inflicted solely to cement her absolute power. To this day, historians and experts still debate the depth of her depravity and exactly how she became so cold-blooded. Given the extreme nature and frequency of her brutality, she showed absolutely no signs of remorse or empathy. If you want to see the detailed breakdown of this terrifying woman's descent into evil, check out our previous Irma Grese video on the channel or find the link in the comments. Let's turn back the clock to April 15, 1945. The location, the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Picture this. You're a soldier in the British 11th Armored Division. You're sitting atop a tank, its heavy tracks grinding the dirt road into dust as you roll toward the camp gates. You think you've seen the full horrors of war. Think again. When those gates swing open, the first thing that hits you isn't the enemy, it's the smell. A thick, metallic stench that could haunt you for the rest of your life if you don't have a stomach of steel. It is the stench of thousands of rotting corpses, of rampant disease, of despair so thick you could cut it with a knife. Living skeletons with hollow, sunken eyes stare blankly at you. These are prisoners dying by inches from starvation and inhumane torture. In the midst of this chaotic hellscape, while other cowardly SS officers were stripping off their uniforms and running for their lives, one figure stood their ground, cold, motionless. That was Irma Grese. Why didn't she run? Was she stupid or just blindingly arrogant? She truly believed she was the queen of this kingdom, and a queen never abandons her throne, even if that throne is built on a pile of bones. Even on April 17, 1945, when the handcuffs slapped onto her wrists, Grese held her head high with a look of pure, defiant arrogance. British Brigadier Bob Daniel, a battle-hardened man, walked into the camp quarters to inspect the area. He turned his back, letting his guard down. And what did Irma Grese do? In a moment of absolute madness, she drew her pistol, the shiny accessory she used to terrorize weak prisoners. She aimed the barrel right at the Allied general's back, all while holding a leash attached to her Alsatian dog. Let's hit the pause button right here. You have to understand, Germany had already lost. Hitler was cowering in a bunker. Yet this 22-year-old brat still planned to shoot a British general? What was going through her head? But reality came crashing down hard. When Bob Daniel spun around and barked a command, Grese's warrior facade shattered. She didn't pull the trigger like the tough girl she pretended to be. She ran away. It was an act that was both laughable and pathetic. It exposed Grese's true nature, a cowardly bully who only dared to be cruel to the weak but cowered before the strong. I don't think her initial hostility was courage. It was a delusion of power so deep it was pathological. You might think arrest was the punishment. Not exactly. Grese and the other female guards were found in the women's section of Belsen, but unlike the men, they weren't immediately hauled off to prison cells. The British had a much more profound punishment in mind. They wanted to break the fake, polished pride of the SS. Irma Grese, who always appeared with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, a crisp uniform, and polished boots, was dragged out into the camp yard. Her task? Burying the dead. Not one or two bodies. We're talking about 10,000 corpses scattered everywhere. Imagine those pristine white hands, which once held a whip to tear open human flesh, now forced to touch decomposing, ulcerated bodies, people she once considered trash. She had to drag them through the mud and throw them into mass graves. Every corpse she touched forced her to confront her own handiwork. The stench of death clung to her hair, her skin, her clothes. No expensive perfume could mask it now. This was the ultimate humiliation for someone as obsessed with appearances as Grese. But looking into her eyes, there was still no remorse, only disgust and rage at being forced to do menial work. Cut to a cold interrogation room at the Armored Training School about 2 miles from Belsen. Here, Grese showed the world the peak of emotional numbness and unrepentant inhumanity. Facing the investigator, Irma Grese sat there, not a single tear, no begging. When asked why she did these evil things, her answer sent a chill through the entire room. Grese calmly replied, "It was our duty to exterminate anti-social elements to ensure the future of Germany." On June 16, 1945, she was charged with murder and mistreatment of prisoners at both Auschwitz and Belsen. Do you see? In her twisted mind, she wasn't committing murder. She was carrying out a noble mission, social cleansing. She believed she was a diligent gardener, pulling up weeds to protect the garden of Germany, a coward who ran when yelled at, yet coldly declared murder a duty. The Nazi brainwashing had seeped into her bone marrow, turning a country girl into a killing machine without a conscience. That statement wasn't a defense, it was a manifesto of evil. September 17, 1945. The courtroom in Lüneburg is packed to the rafters. 45 defendants sit in rows. Yet almost every camera lens and every curious pair of eyes is glued to a single spot, defendant number 9. That is Irma Grese. Just look at her. Surrounded by a group of aging, disheveled, and terrified war criminals, Irma Grese radiates a bizarre kind of glow. In terms of looks and aura alone, she is in a league of her own. Her blonde hair is intricately styled, her tailored uniform hugging a fit, athletic frame. She doesn't look like a prisoner facing a death sentence. She looks like she's sitting front row at a fashion show, aloof, bored, and utterly cold. During recess, while other defendants slumped their heads in anxiety, what did Irma do? She pulled out a compact mirror, calmly fixing every stray curl, admiring her own reflection. That calmness wasn't bravery, it was a mockery. It was defiance. The truth was, she had no bargaining chips left to flip the script. Then the prosecutor dimmed the lights. Footage from the liberation of Belsen began to roll. Mass graves, piles of skin and bone corpses stacked like firewood, the haunting, hollow eyes of the dying. The entire courtroom held its breath. Many burst into tears. Some vomited, unable to stomach the naked truth. Even the toughest British officers had to look away. The camera zoomed in on Irma Grese's face. The audience waited for a flinch, a tear, or at least a head bowed in shame. But no. Her face remained as hard as stone. Her blue eyes locked onto the screen without a flicker of emotion, numb, cold. She watched the slaughter of human beings the same way we might watch a boring weather forecast. It seemed to mean nothing to her. Why would it? She had seen it all live, in color, by her own hand. This was just a movie. Her emotional callousness had been forged and hardened over years of witnessing and causing this reality firsthand. That was the most terrifying moment of the trial, not the accusations, but the total absence of humanity in her eyes. Grese was held responsible for crimes that stained Bergen-Belsen and Birkenau with blood between October 1942 and April 1945. She faced 2 separate counts of war crimes. Before the dock, she refused to bow. Her voice rang out cold, sounding half like a justification and half like a lukewarm confession. Himmler is responsible for everything that happened, but I suppose I am as much to blame as the others above me. Then came the witnesses. Many couldn't imagine or believe the depth of her cruelty, that she was truly the worst female warden. Survivors, the walking skeletons who had cheated the Grim Reaper, took the stand one by one. They pointed shaking fingers straight at the beautiful beast, testifying how she whipped prisoners to death with steel-braided crops, unleashed dogs to tear people apart, and personally selected victims for the gas chambers. Their words were like daggers piercing the thick air of the courtroom. The indictment of murder and abuse at both Auschwitz and Belsen became undeniably clear. Yet Irma Grese sat there, chin tilted up, sneering. Her cold, arrogant, unrepentant attitude continued throughout the trial. She snapped back with curt answers like, "I should know better than you whether I had a dog or not, don't you think? And I wish you would stop using the word constantly," referring to the endless accusations of her relentless violence. But ladies and gentlemen, every good script needs a plot twist, and the crack in the iceberg that was Irma Grese appeared on the 23rd day of the trial. The doors opened. A young girl walked in. It was Helene, Irma's younger sister, brought in as a character witness. Helene didn't talk about crimes. She talked about the past. She spoke of a poverty-stricken childhood, a mother who committed suicide by drinking poison, and a harsh, abusive father who effectively pushed Irma into the arms of the Nazi Party. And for the first and only time during the trial, Irma Grese broke. She slumped forward. Her shoulders shook violently. She sobbed uncontrollably. Why was she crying? I don't believe these were tears of remorse for her victims. Irma wasn't crying for the Jewish children she sent to the gas chambers. She was crying for herself. She was weeping for the little girl Irma, who had been beaten down by life. This was the pinnacle of narcissism. Even in pain, she only felt sorry for herself. This detail doesn't make her pitiable. It makes the portrait of this monster more twisted and tragic than ever. But these tears weren't enough to wash away her guilt. By mid-November, the trial was nearing its end. Grese fell back on the standard Nazi defense. Concentration camp prisoners were trash, anti-social elements. And her? She was just a diligent soldier, following orders, who saw nothing wrong with her actions. Prosecutor Backhouse countered brilliantly. He painted her as a coward, a shy child who ran away from fights, who only found her courage when she put on a Nazi uniform and realized no one dared to hit her back. November 17, 1945, after more than 50 tense days, Major General Bernie Ficklin, the judge, stood up. The courtroom fell into a dead silence. You could hear hearts pounding in chests. Irma Grese, along with Elizabeth Volkenrath and Juana Bormann, her colleagues in cruelty, were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. The room erupted. She stood there, her face returning to its mask of ice. She showed no regret for her atrocities and maintained her arrogance right up until the moment of execution. But I have to wonder, at that moment, did she finally realize that the Third Reich, her delusional empire, had officially collapsed? You see, this trial wasn't just justice being served, it was a macabre display of human psychology. Until the very last minute, Irma Grese believed she was right, clinging to her glamorous exterior to hide a soul that was completely rotten. The convicted criminals were hauled back to their cells in Lüneburg. It was only then, behind closed doors, that her lawyer, Cranfield, finally saw Grese weep openly. Humans tend to cling to hope until the bitter end, and Grese was no exception. She and her accomplices filed an appeal to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the most powerful man in the British Army at the time. What was she hoping for? Clemency? A miracle? But no. The appeal was coldly rejected. Montgomery's signature was the final nail in her coffin. Hope was extinguished. Now it was just a countdown. Once the death sentence was confirmed, Irma Grese was no longer defendant number 9. She was a dead woman, walking, counting down the seconds. On December 10th, she was transferred to Hamelin Prison. This was the end of the line. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most prolific hangman, was selected to execute the beasts of Belsen. He arrived at Hamelin with a plan: execute the 3 women individually first, then handle the remaining 10 men in pairs to speed up the grisly process. Usually on the night before an execution, what do prisoners do? They sob, they write tear-stained suicide notes, or they fall to their knees begging God for forgiveness. But Irma Grese and her gang were different. And this detail, as I'm digging through her files, sends a shiver down my spine because of the sheer obstinacy, fanaticism, and total lack of repentance. In the pitch-black darkness of Hamelin Prison, there was no wailing, there was singing. Grese and the other female guards sang Nazi anthems at the top of their lungs all night long. They sang with a sick, twisted pride, honoring a regime that had already crumbled to dust. Imagine that scene, people standing on the edge of the abyss about to die, yet frantically praising the very devil who led them to hell, not a shred of remorse. This fanaticism wasn't loyalty anymore. It was a form of collective mass psychosis. December 13th, 1945. The cell door swung open. Light flooded in. The man waiting for her wasn't a guard. It was Albert Pierrepoint, the legendary executioner. Irma Grese stepped out. How did she look? Trembling? Did she need to be held up? Not at all. Reports say she walked out with terrifying stability and calm. She radiated a coldness that surprised even a hangman as seasoned as Pierrepoint. A 22-year-old girl standing before death, yet her heart didn't race and her legs didn't shake. Was that nerves of steel or just the complete emptiness of a soulless shell? Irma stepped onto the wooden trapdoor. The noose dangled in front of her face. She stood on the mark. Just before Pierrepoint could pull the lever to open the floor, Grese shouted, "Schnell," meaning quickly. She wanted to die immediately. That word, Schnell, is incredibly haunting. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was an order. Until her very last breath, Irma Grese wanted to be in control. She wanted death to happen on her terms, at her speed. Or perhaps she was simply bored with a world where her empire had lost. The executioner did his duty, ending the life of one of the 20th century's most brutal murderers. But death wasn't the end. People feared Irma Grese even after she stopped breathing. Her body was not returned to her family. Why? Because the Allies were terrified that her grave would become a shrine for neo-Nazis to worship? They buried her right there in the Hamelin prison yard instead of a cemetery. It wasn't until 1954 that her remains were moved to the Amville Cemetery. But even then, it remains a lonely, unmarked grave to prevent it from becoming a temple for the new Nazis. Irma Grese is the clearest proof of one thing. Evil doesn't just come from actions, it comes from the absolute coldness of the human heart. Irma Grese's life ended at 22, a young life, but one soaked in blood. Justice was finally served, and the death sentence was carried out following the Belsen Trial. But there is a twist so ironic it's almost laughable, a detail few people realize. Before her dark fate was sealed, the beautiful beast actually harbored a dream. While standing in the middle of a concentration camp reeking of death, Irma would often daydream about the day Germany won the war. In her fantasy, she wouldn't be a prison guard. She was going to be a star on the silver screen. She wanted her name up in lights on the marquee. She craved the world's adoration for her beauty. And you know what? She did become world famous, but not as a movie star. She became the global poster child for pure evil. Instead of walking a red carpet to thunderous applause, she was dumped into the dirt of a prison yard, an unmarked grave buried under the weight of humanity's contempt. So, here is a question for you to chew on. What do you think drove women in the Nazi regime, like Grese, to become just as brutal, if not sometimes even more vicious, than their male counterparts?